There is a particular kind of silence that a room produces when it realizes it has made an error it cannot correct. I have stood in many rooms over the course of my career. I have witnessed silence of many kinds. The silence of deliberation, slow and institutional, like sediment settling. The silence of grief, which is its own category and should not be confused with anything else. The silence that follows a vote that everyone in the chamber knew was wrong, and no one was willing to say so out loud. But the silence I think about now, the one I carry the way a person carries an old injury that aches only in particular weather, is the silence of the Inner Compact's Centennial session on the morning I walked back through its doors and answered my name. That was 4 years ago. I am retired now, formally and completely this time, with a pension and a commendation letter from the Foreign Affairs Directorate, and a small apartment in the coastal district outside the capital, where the light comes through in long flat bars each morning, and the sea makes a sound against the breakwall that I find, on most days, sufficient company. People ask me sometimes how I did it. Younger diplomats, mostly officers in their first or second corridor postings, who have heard the story, in the shortened form it takes, when it passes through enough hands. She came back. She sat down. The compact couldn't remove her. The seat was reinstated. They want to know the mechanism, and I tell them. I tell them about Article 9. I tell them about Article 11. I tell them about the credential renewal schedule, and the historic membership role, and the quorum requirement, and the way those three things fit together, precisely and completely, into a door that no one had thought to lock, because no one had imagined anyone would still be standing outside it. 31 years later, with the key still in hand. What I do not tell them is how it felt to wait, how it felt to spend 3 decades holding a credential no one was asking to see, in a career that had been officially suspended at its highest point, for a moment that might not arrive for another generation and might, if the compact amended its founding charter during that time, never arrive at all. I do not tell them, because it is not transferable information. It is not a technique. The only reason I was able to wait is that I am the kind of person who is able to wait, and either you are that kind of person, or you are not. And knowing the difference does not change which one you are. But I am writing this down because the record should exist, and because the record that currently exists in the Compact's official archive is accurate as far as it goes, and profoundly incomplete in every way that matters. Here is what actually happened. The Inner Compact was formed 217 years before I was born, as a coordinating body for 7 species who shared a navigational corridor through what was then contested transit space. The founding dispute had been between 2 of those species, the Dravani and the Gelu, over competing claims to the corridor's primary transit lanes. The other 5 species had been drawn in as interested parties, mediators, and eventually co-signatories to the founding charter that resolved the dispute by distributing administrative responsibility across all 7. No single species would control the corridor. They would administer it together, through a body with a long table and a fixed quorum requirement, and a charter thick enough that any given grievance could usually be addressed, without anyone having to admit in public that another delegation had been right. It was never intended to be a governing authority. Over the following century and a half it became one anyway, in the incremental way that coordinating bodies always do, through accumulated agreements, shared infrastructure, mutual defense clauses, trade protocols, and the simple weight of 200 years of decisions that other entities had built their own operations around. By the time Earth applied for a seat, the Inner Compact administered transit licensing for the entire corridor, maintained the region's shared archive registry, adjudicated 17 categories of interspecies dispute, and collected a corridor use fee that funded itself and 3 subsidiary agencies. It was, in practice, the closest thing the Central Corridor had to a political body with teeth. Earth was granted a seat in the 63rd year of contact with corridor species. The specific negotiations, the specific arguments made by the specific people who secured that seat, are a matter of record and not my story to tell. What matters is that the seat existed, and that it was filled for 47 years by a sequence of human ambassadors who did their work with competence and without drama, and that the inner compact grew accustomed to us the way a body grows accustomed to something that has always been present, unremarkable, occasionally useful, not particularly examined. I was appointed to the seat in the 91st year of the compact's relationship with Earth. I was 42 years old. I had spent the previous 19 years in the Directorate's Corridor Affairs Division, where I had made the compact's founding documents and charter history my professional specialty, not because anyone had asked me to, but because the seat mattered, and because I believed, with the particular confidence of a person who has not yet learned where their confidence will eventually fail them, that understanding a mechanism and being able to use it were essentially the same thing. I was not entirely wrong. I was merely early. My first 4 years in the seat were, by the standard of what followed, thoroughly unremarkable. The compact met in full session 4 times annually, and in closed committee on an irregular schedule driven by whatever disruption had most recently surfaced in the corridor. I attended all of it. I argued when I had grounds to argue, voted on the positions the Directorate gave me, filed the required reports, and tried to understand, through the long process of sitting in a room with the same people across many sessions, what each delegation actually wanted, as distinct from what they were willing to say they wanted in the record. These are not always the same thing. In my experience, they are rarely the same thing, and the distance between them is where most of the real work happens. The 2 relationships I valued most from those years were with Vel Ansara of the Civith and Prem HFY of the Karathi. Vel Ansara had a habit of leaving small folded paper structures on the table in front of her, while she was thinking not origami in any formal sense, just the kind of absent, precise manipulation of whatever material was at hand that some people do when their mind is working hard on something else. She thought hard almost constantly, and the table in front of her was always slightly cluttered with the evidence of it. Oshavai had been at the compact for 30 years, and had developed, over the course of that tenure, opinions about every procedural ruling in the body's history. These opinions were detailed, well-sourced, and reliably accurate. No one solicited them. He provided them anyway, with the patient thoroughness of someone who had stopped expecting gratitude for being right, and had simply made peace with the fact that he was right, and that someone should be saying so. I liked them both very much. They were serious people, doing serious work in a setting that did not always reward seriousness, and they did it anyway. The other 5 delegations were less constant in their seriousness. The Gelu bloc, 3 species whose interests aligned so consistently that they had voted in near-perfect coordination for 40 years, held the compact's largest combined share of transit infrastructure, and oriented most of their attention accordingly. What was good for corridor transit fees was what the Gelu wanted, and they pursued it with the focused efficiency of entities that had decided, long ago, what they were for, and had not been distracted from it since. The Halvith delegation, which held the rotating chair during my tenure, was efficient, formal, and operated with the particular quality of institutional confidence that comes from having been the largest species at a table for longer than anyone else can remember. And the Dravani, the 7th delegation, the eldest members, the original disputants from whom the entire compact had grown, sat at the far end of the table across every session I attended, said very little, and watched everything. I never fully understood what the Dravani were thinking. I am not certain anyone did, and I suspect that was a deliberate choice on their part. I had been in the seat for 4 years and 7 months when the administrative committee's procedural note arrived. It came on a Thursday morning, filed through the standard directorate channel as a routine administrative notification, the kind of document that, on a different day, might have sat in the incoming queue for several hours before anyone looked at it closely. But the subject line used a specific classification code that my predecessor had flagged in the handover materials as requiring immediate review, and so it came to my desk, flagged, and I opened it within the hour. The note informed the directorate that Earth's seat classification had been revised following a routine audit of the active roster. The audit, the note explained, was conducted under Article 7 of the Founding Charter, which established minimum participation thresholds for all seated delegations. Earth's delegation had not met the minimum threshold for full seat status in the preceding calendar period. The seat would be reclassified. The next session's roll would not include Earth's name. I read the note 3 times. I read Article 7. I pulled the participation records for Earth's delegation across the calendar period in question. My records, my attendance logs, my voting record, my filed committee contributions, and cross-referenced them against the threshold definition as it appeared in Article 7's current annotated version. Then I pulled the original unannotated version of Article 7, the text as it had appeared in the Founding Charter before any of the 6 subsequent amendments had been applied to it. Then I read each of the 6 amendments in sequence, beginning with the first and working forward. The 5th Amendment had modified the participation calculation methodology. The 6th Amendment, the most recent, ratified in the 31st year of the Compact, the one that no one had needed to revisit because no delegation's numbers had ever been close to the threshold before, had introduced a further adjustment that applied to the 5th Amendment's methodology. When I applied the 6th Amendment's adjustment to the 5th Amendment's methodology and ran the calculation against the original unannotated Article 7 text, I got a different threshold number than the one in the annotated version. The difference was small, 3 7/10%, but it was not negligible, because 3 7/10% was exactly the gap between Earth's participation numbers and the threshold the Administrative Committee had applied. Under the original text with both amendments applied correctly, Earth's numbers cleared the requirement. The annotated version had incorporated the 5th Amendment's methodology correctly, but had misread the 6th Amendment's adjustment. The error had been in the annotation for 9 years without anyone noticing, because no delegation's numbers had been close enough to the threshold for the error to produce a different result until now. The Administrative Committee had applied the annotated version, which was the accepted authoritative text, and had applied it correctly. The annotation was wrong. I wrote a formal objection, cited the charter texts and the amendment sequence, and filed it before noon. The Administrative Committee issued its response 14 days later. The response acknowledged that I had identified a discrepancy in the annotation. It concluded that the annotation, having been in accepted use as the authoritative text for 9 years without formal challenge, constituted established practice under Article 19's Stability Clause. A challenge filed after the fact, during an audit process already concluded, did not meet the threshold for retroactive revision. The reclassification stood. I read the response once. I set it down on my desk. I looked out the window at the corridor hub's transit lanes and watched 3 Civith cargo haulers pass in sequence, moving in the same direction, taking the same transit corridor they had been using since before I was born, doing the work that the corridor had always existed to enable. Then I went and found Article 9. Article 9 of the Founding Charter concerns the status of seated delegations during periods of administrative dispute, contested credentials, or unresolved classification questions. It was written into the original text during the founding negotiations, when the Dravani and the Gelu had disagreed over whether a seated delegation could be suspended unilaterally by the administrative body, or whether any suspension required the consent of the Compact's full membership. They had reached a resolution. A delegation's credentials remained valid and active until 2 specific conditions were both satisfied. First, a formal revocation of the appointment filed by the originating world. Second, a formal acknowledgement of that revocation entered into the record by a quorum of the Compact's full membership in session. Both conditions were required. Neither was sufficient alone. The administrative body could audit, reclassify, and remove a delegation from the active roster. But unless the originating world had filed a revocation and a quorum had acknowledged it, the delegation's credentials did not terminate. They entered an ambiguous suspended state that the Founding Charter specifically declined to treat as termination. The Administrative Committee's action had not been a revocation It had been a roster reclassification under Article 7. Earth had not filed a revocation. The compact had not assembled a quorum to acknowledge one. Under Article 9, my appointment was not ended. It was suspended in a state that the Charter itself had named and described and refused to call termination. I went to Halvoran. Halvoran was the Directorate's senior undersecretary for corridor affairs, a man who had been in the division longer than anyone currently serving under him, who had watched enough of these situations develop and resolved to have burned away most of his professional optimism and replaced it with something more useful. A precise and unsentimental ability to evaluate what a situation actually was, as opposed to what the parties involved preferred to claim it was. He was not an easy man to bring difficult findings to, because he would not manage your feelings about those findings, and he would tell you immediately, without softening, what he thought the problems were. I laid out the entire chain for him. Article 7 and the annotation error, the objection and the response, Article 9's credential suspension mechanics. He read the documents I gave him in silence. He did not interrupt. When he finished, he set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was taking a moment before responding. He said, "You've read this correctly. Article 9 is exactly what you think it is." I said I knew. He said, "The practical difficulty is the quorum vote. To get back in through a standard reinstatement motion, someone has to put it on the agenda. The administrative committee controls the agenda. They'll table it indefinitely, and the chair will support them." I said I knew that too. He said, "What's Article 11? I said, "Centennial session. Full assembly, full historic membership roll call. All delegations that have ever held a seat, not just the active roster. The historic record must be called. Any delegation whose Article 9 credentials remain technically valid is entitled to answer. The quorum that assembled to hear the roll has, by assembling, consented to the calling. You cannot refuse an answer that's already been given in front of a quorum without going into procedural violation of Article 11 itself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When is the next Centennial session?" I said, 31 years. He was quiet for longer that time. He looked at the papers again, not because there was anything new in them, but because it is sometimes useful to have something to look at while you are deciding something. He said, "You'd have to maintain the credentials continuously, on the standard renewal schedule, without lapse. Any gap in the renewal chain gives them grounds to argue Article 9 doesn't apply." I said yes. He said, "You'd have to be physically present in the chamber when the name is called. Article 11 has a presence clause. Proxy representation is challengeable." I said yes. He said, "If they amend Article 11 before the Centennial, if they add a validity clause that excludes reclassified delegations, or change the historic role definition, or restructure the quorum requirement, this collapses. Everything you're planning depends on them not thinking to close it." I said yes. I had looked at this problem from as many directions as I could find, and that risk was real. The notification provision gave me 30 days if an amendment was filed. 30 days was not much, but it was enough to make moving against them costly, and I had reasons to think they would not want to make that kind of visible noise about a delegation they believed had already accepted its situation. Closing a mechanism that no one knew was open was not straightforward. It required explaining why you were closing it, which required explaining that you knew it was open, which required explaining that you had known the delegation was planning to use it, which required explaining why you had watched and waited rather than acting earlier. The compact did not like explaining things. It preferred to proceed as though the situation had always been what it currently appeared to be. Halvoran said, "We don't make this public. We don't pursue reinstatement through any other channel. If they find out we're planning to use this, they'll find a way to close it that doesn't require explaining why. We keep it to 4 people. My successor when I retire. The archivist who processes your renewals. You. Me. Until I'm not here." I said I understood. He said, "Sarah." He said my name the way people say a name when they want to make sure you understand that what they are about to say is directed at you specifically and not at the general situation. 31 years. I said, I know. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, all right. The renewal will stay on schedule. Budgeted under standard credential maintenance. No flagging. He picked up the papers and set them to one side. I'll want a written analysis from you before the end of the month. The full chain. Every article, every amendment, every contingency. So that if I'm not here when this happens, whoever replaces me has the complete picture. I delivered the analysis within 3 weeks. I have never shown it to anyone outside the 4 people. I am told it is still in the Directorate's restricted archive, filed under a classification code that has not been reviewed since Halvoran's successor retired. I went home. I took a posting in the Directorate's archival division, which was funded adequately, and attended to very little by anyone with the ambition and attention that corridor affairs attracted. I renewed my credentials every 4 years as a matter of routine, in the same administrative batch as several hundred other Directorate staff who maintained active credentials for professional continuity. I did not appear at any compact adjacent event. I did not contact any of the delegations. I did not speak publicly about the reclassification, except on the one occasion when a journalist writing a retrospective piece on Earth's corridor history asked me about it directly, at which point I said that these things are part of the work and left it there, which was true and uninformative in equal measure. I want to be precise about what those years were, because imprecision about them would be a form of dishonesty, and I have tried throughout my career to be honest about the things that cost something. They were not heroic years. There was no ongoing struggle, no sustained campaign, no visible effort that required courage or endurance in any form that anyone outside that very small circle of 4 people could observe or recognize. From the outside, they looked like the unremarkable later career of a diplomat whose most significant posting had ended early and who had moved into administrative work without complaint and without visible bitterness. From the inside, they felt most of the time, most days like exactly that, because the work in the archival division was real work, and it required real attention, and I gave it real attention. I was not marking time. I was working, and the work mattered, and I believed it mattered, and that belief was not a performance for anyone's benefit. It was simply true. But underneath the work, in the way that a document with 2 layers always has the second layer present, even when you are reading the first, there was the waiting. It did not announce itself. It did not produce drama or visible suffering, or the kind of consuming obsession that makes for a better narrative, but is, in my experience, rarely how actual patience works. It was simply there. A fixed point. An appointment kept at a great distance from the moment of the appointment itself, but kept nonetheless. The way you keep an appointment you have made years in advance by occasionally confirming, to yourself, that you still intend to show up. What made it possible? What I think makes this kind of waiting possible for the kind of person who is capable of it, is that I knew the mechanism. I was not waiting in hope. I was not waiting in faith. I was waiting in the knowledge that a specific provision of a specific founding document, correctly applied, produced a specific outcome, and that if I was at the right place at the right moment, the mechanism would run exactly as written. Hope and faith are useful, but they are not the same as a charter citation. The charter citation does not require that you believe it will work. It requires only that it be accurate, and that you be present. I confirmed the mechanism was still intact every year. Not obsessively once a year, no more. A systematic review of any charter amendments filed since the previous review. 9 times in 31 years, I flagged an amendment as requiring closer reading. 7 of those 9 resolved on examination as touching areas irrelevant to Article 9 or Article 11. 1 filed in the 18th year by the Gelu block proposed a revision to Article 7's threshold calculation methodology that, if it had passed, would have retrospectively validated the annotation error and removed the basis for my original objection. It failed to achieve the required two-thirds majority. I watched the vote count come in with the same external composure I maintained for everything connected to this matter. And only after I had filed my annual review and closed my terminal did I sit for a while in the silence of my office and feel the specific relief of a structural support that you have been watching for a long time, holding under the load. It was built to hold. The Ninth Amendment that required close reading was filed in the 26th year. It touched Article 11 directly. My hands were very still while I read it. I read it 4 times. It was a proposal to add a formal attendance registration requirement to the Centennial session delegations wishing to attend would need to file a pre-registration 30 days in advance. The proposal included a clause specifying that only delegations on the current active roster were eligible to pre-register. If it passed, the pre-registration clause would not have voided my Article 9 credentials, but it would have created a procedural barrier to entering the chamber on the day of the session, and a procedural barrier, in a setting where the administrative committee controlled the machinery, could be made practically insurmountable regardless of its theoretical resolution. I spent 3 days reading the notification provision, the amendment's own procedural requirements, and every related charter section before I concluded that the amendment had been drafted imprecisely enough that challenging it would not have been difficult, but also that it was unlikely to pass, because it created administrative burdens on active delegations as well. And the Dravani, who disliked administrative burdens on their own operations, would vote against it. The Dravani voted against it. The amendment failed by 6 votes. I closed my terminal. I went home. I made dinner and read something that had nothing to do with charter law and went to bed. In the morning I came back and did my work. That is what 31 years of waiting looked like. That is all of it that was unusual. And it was unusual only in aggregate. Any single year of it was simply a year. What I did, alongside the waiting, was read. I had the compact session records, which were published as a matter of charter obligation to all historic members, including lapsed and reclassified ones. A provision the compact had not reconsidered, because reclaiming that publishing obligation from a delegation it wanted to forget about would have required acknowledging the delegation still existed in a meaningful sense. I read every session record, every charter amendment, every proposed amendment that failed, every procedural ruling, every interdelegation agreement that touched anything connected to Article 9 or Article 11, or the historic membership roll provision. I built, over those years, a complete working map of the compact's procedural architecture, every load-bearing element, every place where the original charter language and the accumulated practice had diverged, every point at which a targeted amendment could destabilize what I was planning. If they were going to close the mechanism, I needed to see it before it closed. If they filed an Article 11 amendment, I would have the 30-day notification window, and I would use every hour of it. They never filed one. I watched for 17 years before I stopped watching with any kind of urgency and started watching the way you watch something you have already assessed as a habit, a professional background practice, because the absence of an amendment filing was itself information, and you did not stop collecting information just because you had gone a long time without finding a new problem. In the 28th year, Velinsara reached me through a private channel. She was very old. The Sivith have a longer natural lifespan than humans, but the decades had not left her unaffected, and her messages had the quality that I have noticed in correspondence from people who have made peace with how much time remains precise, without decoration, oriented toward what matters and away from what merely sounds like it matters. She said, "I know you are coming back. I have known for some time. I want you to know that when the roll is called, there are delegations at this table who understand what the calling means." I wrote back asking how long she had known. She wrote back, "Since the 3rd year after you left, Prem HFY read Article 11 on a slow afternoon and mentioned it to me as a theoretical curiosity, the kind of thing you find in old founding charters when you are reading them closely enough. We worked through the rest of the chain together. We sat with it for a while. Then we decided we would not tell anyone who might try to close it. I held that for a long moment before I responded. I had assumed, for 28 years, that no one at the table knew. I had assumed that the silence on that side was the silence of a body that had forgotten about a name it had decided to stop calling. It was not. At least 2 of the people in that room had known for 25 years, and had chosen, deliberately, to let the mechanism stay open. I wrote back. I hope the compact deserves the 2 of you. She wrote, It doesn't. That is not why we do the work. That was the last message I received from Velensara. She died in the 31st year, 8 months before the Centennial session. Her successor, a much younger woman named Tay Soren, sent me a brief, formal notification, and a note that Velensara had left in the session preparation files for the Centennial. The note contained no instructions. It was 3 lines from the compact's founding address, the words spoken at the original signing ceremony, before the first delegations took their seats. The corridor belongs to those who come to the table prepared to hold it. The table has no memory of its own. What is remembered must be remembered by those who keep their seat. I read those 3 lines several times. Then I packed a bag. I arrived at the corridor hub 3 days before the Centennial session. The hub was larger than I remembered. 31 years of corridor growth had added transit infrastructure and administrative buildings, and the kind of low-level commercial accumulation that collects around any place where a large number of species converge regularly on business. The central transit hall had been expanded twice, judging by the visible seams in the flooring, where older stone met newer composite. The species mix in the corridors had shifted more Sisyphith than I remembered. Fewer Halveth, a Dravani mission office that had not existed when I last walked through. The signage was in 5 languages where it had been in 3. The compact's building was the same. Old stone and brushed steel, the architectural signature of the corridor's earliest permanent structures, built to last in a way that announced its own intention and had delivered on it for 2 centuries. It sat at the end of the hub's administrative district, exactly where it had always sat. Its entrance flanked by the 2 founding-era pillars that bore the compact's original seal in carved stone above the door. I had walked through that entrance hundreds of times. I stood outside it for a moment. Not because I needed to prepare myself. I had been preparing for 31 years, and any additional preparation at this point would have been theater, but because it seemed right to be briefly outside before being inside, to acknowledge the distance between the last time and this time. Then I went in. I went first to the credentialing annex, the small administrative office that handled routine documentation for active delegations, not the main building. The side annex, where the practical business was conducted without ceremony. I presented my credentials at the window. They were current. The credential file had been renewed on the standard schedule, continuously, without gap, for 31 years. The clerk was a young Halveth woman who checked the database with the efficient detachment of someone processing routine documentation, confirmed the renewal date, confirmed the active status flag, and asked what I needed. I told her I would be attending the Centennial session under the Article 11 Historic Membership Role provision. I told her my delegation was not on the confirmed attendees list, because the confirmed list was the active roster, not the historic role, and that the Article 11 provision was a separate basis for attendance. I gave her the article numbers. I gave her the relevant charter citations. I used a tone that was informational rather than confrontational, because this was not a confrontation, it was a procedural notification, and I had been making procedural notifications for most of my professional life. She went to get her supervisor. The supervisor was a Dravani man, middle-aged, with the particular manner of a career administrative official who has spent long enough resolving procedural irregularities to have stopped being surprised by them and started simply evaluating them. He reviewed my credentials. He reviewed the article citations. He went to his desk and read his terminal for longer than my credentials alone would have required, which told me he was reading the session preparation file, or the charter annotation, or both. and that someone had anticipated this moment well enough to prepare documentation for it. When he came back to the window, his expression was the expression of someone who has reviewed a situation, found it to be exactly what it appeared to be, and is now obligated to act on that finding, regardless of whether acting on it will be straightforward. He said, "The session convenes at the 9th hour tomorrow morning. Historic roll call is the second agenda item, following opening formalities. Your delegation should be in the chamber for the opening." I said I would be there. I was there. The Centennial chamber was the oldest room in the building, a circular hall with a high ceiling and good acoustics, and a single long table arranged in a closed oval, so that every delegation faced inward and could see across the width of the table to every delegation on the opposite side. The seats were unmarked. Tradition placed each delegation in the same position they had occupied at the original founding, and the positions had been maintained, through 200 years of sessions, as carefully as anything else in the charter. Earth's seat was third from the end on the north side of the oval, facing the arc of windows that looked out over the hub's transit lanes. I had sat in that seat for 4 years and 7 months. The chair was the same type, same material, same proportions, different individual chair, but the same design, maintained in the same way the room was maintained, as something that was supposed to last. I set my credential folio on the table in front of me and folded my hands and waited. The Centennial chamber had the particular quality of old rooms that have been maintained with precision, not restored. Maintained, which is a different thing. Restoration introduces newness into the record. Maintenance preserves the record as it actually was. The stone of the walls was the same stone that had been there at the founding, grayed by 2 centuries of air and light, worn smooth at the edges by 2 centuries of hands. The acoustics were the same acoustics the founding delegations had spoken into good, even, carrying sound across the oval without amplification or distortion. You could hear a person speak clearly from any seat at the table to any other, which had been a deliberate design choice by the architects, and which I had always understood as a statement about the kind of work a founding negotiation required. You had to be able to hear the other side. The room was built to make that unavoidable. I looked out the windows at the hub's transit lanes. 3 ships passing, unhurried, moving in the early light against the pale sky. The corridor doing what it had always done. 11 delegations took their seats. The Civith second chair, Tay Soren, met my eyes when she sat down and gave me a small, composed nod that Velansara could not have bettered. HFY's successor had been briefed. His expression when he saw me was not surprise, but something closer to the professional satisfaction of a person who has been told that a long-pending matter is finally being resolved. The Gelu block took their 3 seats with coordinated efficiency, and then Thres Vaughn, the senior Gelu delegate, who had been on the administrative committee 31 years ago, and who had, I knew from the session records, personally reviewed the Article 7 audit that produced the reclassification, looked across the table, and saw me. He did not look away immediately. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized from other rooms. The expression of a person who has just understood that a situation they believed was fully resolved had not been fully resolved, and that the resolution had failed at a point so far in the past that there was nothing to be done about it now. Then he looked at the Halveth chair, who was settling her papers at the head of the oval with the air of someone who had reviewed the relevant documentation and had made her decision about how the session would be conducted. Then he looked back at his own papers and said nothing. The Halveth chair opened the session, founding recitation, procedural notes, acknowledgement of the Centennial date. She was methodical and precise, as she had always been, and she moved through the formalities at the pace of someone who understood that what mattered was coming, and that the formalities before it needed to be completed with proper attention before the real business could begin. Then she said, "Second item, the Centennial Historic Membership Roll Call. Under Article 1 of the founding charter, all delegations holding seats on the historic membership record are to be called. Delegations confirm presence by name and credential identifier. She began at the beginning of the roll. The Dravani answered first, as the founding disputants whose original conflict had made the compact necessary. Then, the other founding species in signing order. Then the subsequent admissions in the sequence of their admission. 11 names, 11 answers, each one recorded in the session log, each one building the quorum that the chamber had assembled to constitute. Then the 12th name, Ambassador Sira Voss, Earth Delegation. I said, present. Credential identifier, Delta 7, Ocean 4. Renewed continuously from original appointment, current, as of this session. The room went still. Not the stillness of shock, not for the Halveth chair, not for the Drevany, not for the Sivith second chair or Oshovi's successor. They had known this was coming, or had suspected it, or had at minimum reviewed their files carefully enough to understand what they were looking at when I sat down. The stillness was the stillness of a moment, landing the specific, different quality of silence that occurs when something that has been theoretical for a long time becomes actual. The math had always worked. The mechanism had always been there. But this was not the math. This was the moment. Vaughn broke it. He said, Chair, a point of order. The Halveth chair said, the delegate will be recognized following the completion of the roll call record entry. He said, the Earth delegation's seat was reclassified under Article 7. The presence of this individual, quote, she said, the Earth delegation's credentials are on file as continuously valid under Article 9. Their attendance at a Centennial historic roll call is provided for under Article 11. The roll call has been made in the presence of a full quorum. The entry will stand. The delegate's objection is noted and will be logged in the session record. She paused for a single beat. Objections to the roll call result may be filed in writing within the standard procedural window. The session will now proceed. He looked at me across the width of the oval table. I looked back. I had nothing to say to him. The Halveth chair had said what needed to be said. The charter had said what it said. I had answered my name in the presence of a quorum that had assembled under Article 11 and could not now unassemble. There is a version of this story in which I say something at that moment, something quiet and hard, and precisely weighted, the kind of line that earns its place in a room where words are consequential. I did not say anything. I had waited 31 years to sit in a room and say one word. I had said it. The rest was procedural. Vaughn filed a formal objection that afternoon. 2 of the Gelu delegations filed supporting briefs. The third Gelu delegate, the youngest of the 3, filed no brief and said nothing in the subsequent session discussions, which I noted and did not speculate about in writing. The Halveth chair received the objections, numbered them, and referred them to the Compact's Charter Review Panel under the standard timeline. The panel published its determination 8 weeks later. It was 6 pages, carefully written, and it could be summarized this way. The credentials were valid. The Article 9 suspension had never terminated. The Centennial roll call had been conducted in full compliance with Article 11, and no procedural mechanism existed to reverse a completed quorum-witnessed roll call answer without a 2/3 vote, which the Sivith, the Karathi, the Dravani, and 2 additional delegations had indicated they would not supply. The seat was reinstated. The Directorate issued a formal statement welcoming the outcome and expressing appreciation for the Compact's procedural integrity in conducting the Centennial session, according to the founding charter. This statement was accurate in every word, and it was, like most accurate diplomatic statements, somewhat beside the point. I served in the seat for 3 more years. It was good work. There was a treaty dispute in the corridor's outer sectors that required 6 months of sustained committee work and produced an outcome that I believe was fair to the parties involved and will hold for at least 2 decades. There was a joint infrastructure proposal that the Gelu bloc opposed, as they oppose most things that redistribute corridor resources, and that passed anyway, which was satisfying in the way that the right outcome, achieved through the proper mechanism, is always satisfying regardless of how long it took to get there. The Civith second chair, Tay Soren, was a serious person, and we worked well together. The Dravani, across all of it, watched everything and said relatively little. And at the end of my final session, the Dravani delegate, the eldest member of their delegation, a woman who had been at the table for 40 years, said to me, when we were both gathering papers at the close, 31 years is a long time to hold a document. I said, it is. She said, the founding delegation that wrote Article 9 was concerned that 30 years would be the outside limit of any individual's patience. They thought it would prevent the clause from ever being used. She folded her papers with the precise, deliberate movements of someone for whom no gesture is unconsidered. They were not wrong about people generally. They made one assumption that was wrong. I waited. She said, they assumed that someone who had been removed would need to want the seat back in order to return for it. They did not account for someone who simply refused to acknowledge they had left. I said, they wrote a very good charter. I retired the following month. My successor, Tavith, was briefed on the complete charter history before his first session, including the full Article 9 and Article 11 analysis, so that if this ever needs to happen again, which I hope it does not, but which the mechanism makes possible, he will have the documentation. He told me, when I handed over the files, that reading the analysis had changed the way he understood the charter, that it was like being shown the load-bearing walls of a building you had always walked through without thinking about how it stood. I said, yes, that is exactly what it is. The charter is not a document. It is the room you are standing in, the table you are sitting at, the floor under your feet. The people who wrote it built it to hold weight, specific kinds of weight, at specific points. And if you know where those points are, you can stand on them in ways that people who have never read the blueprints cannot reach. I went home to the coastal apartment, and I watched the light come through in the mornings, and I listened to the sea, and I thought, sometimes, about Velansara and her folded paper structures, and the note she left in the Centennial files, and about Halvarin's measured voice, saying 31 years, as though it were a weight he was asking me to confirm I could carry. I had answered the role. The sea makes a sound against the breakwall that I find, on most days, sufficient. The credentials are no longer current. I let them lapse on the day I retired, precisely and formally, with a revocation filed with the Directorate and a notation sent to the Compact's administrative registry. Article 9 is satisfied. Both conditions, finally, in the right order. The seat is occupied by someone who will hold it, and the charter will hold him, and the corridor will continue to move its ships through the lanes beyond the chamber windows, as it has moved them since before the founding, indifferent to the bodies that administrate it, and patient in the way that routes between fixed points are patient, which is to say, permanent, and waiting. What is remembered must be remembered by the ones who keep their seat. I kept mine.